Hi everybody, I'm Neil Langridge from E92 and welcome to the latest edition of the Return of the Hack podcast, focused on cybersecurity issues. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Stuart and Chris from Forcepoint. So thanks very much for joining.
My pleasure.
If you want to kind of introduce yourself and what your role is at Forcepoint.
Certainly, Neil. Yeah, it's great to be with you here today and thank you for inviting us along. So my name is Chris Sherry. I'm the VP of Europe at Forcepoint, which means I'm responsible for the whole of our go-to-market organisation across this incredibly exciting and vibrant theatre that I'm responsible for, and it's very good to be here today.
Smashing. Thank you, Chris. Stuart.
Neil, equally thanks for having us along. So I'm Stuart Wilson. So I look after the pre-sales element of Chris's business, mainly focused on UK and Ireland, but with some responsibility across into a few other European territories.
Excellent. So that's great. So in terms of the kind of key topics, obviously, in terms of Forcepoint, your coverage is kind of quite a broad portfolio, but what we wanted to focus on today was data security, because that's obviously a big focus for you as a business. So if we kind of start with a bit of an overview in terms of maybe your view of the market, in terms of where the cybersecurity market is around data security, because there's been a lot of changes. We've seen definitely a rise in some new acronyms as well, which we always like over the last few years, particularly around DSPM. So yeah, if we want to kind of kick off in terms of your view of where the market is at the moment.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, Neil. And data security at the moment, I think it's an incredibly exciting place to be from a cybersecurity point of view. But it's exciting because there's so much change happening within the market all around us, and what's happening in this world around us is making it increasingly challenging for organizations to secure their data. So I'm very happy that we're kind of focused in that area right now, and particularly as we're seeing at the moment, the rise of artificial intelligence. I think that is the latest and greatest opportunity and threat to any organization out there as they're thinking about how they can take advantage of this amazing tool to drive productivity. But they're also very concerned about the risk that could open themselves up to. So Forcepoint right now, we're right at the heart of these conversations around data security. And our mission is very much to focus on how we can enable any organization to get that visibility and control of their data to ensure that they're secure and enabling themselves to be as productive as possible in this vibrant world that we operate within. Yeah,
absolutely. And Stuart, some of the conversations we maybe be having with customers in terms of their view, in terms of what their priorities need to be around securing data.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Forcepoint is known for a few things, and the great thing with data security for us is it's a natural progression to the conversation that we've had for many years. So you're obviously talking around web security and protecting data going to the internet. It's a natural transition for us to focus on the data aspect of that conversation in much more detail. Chris has touched on AI adoption. And for me, AI adoption is falling into kind of three main areas that we're talking to customers about. So I would look at that as your shadow AI. And that does lend itself to kind of a web security use case. So that's people who are concerned with users just adopting AI technologies in different destinations on the web. That's a web security use case. You want to block those kind of things from happening. You've then got a sanctioned AI, which is your chat GPTs of the world, where people want to utilize them in an organization, but they need to have concern and focus around the data that's actually going to be allowed into those applications. So that's a data security use case. And you mentioned the new acronyms coming along. So the third kind of level of AI for me is that kind of adopted AI within an organization. That's your that's your Geminis and your co-pilots, where people are making a conscious decision to allow those technologies to have full access to their environment and to their data. And that's where technologies like data security posture management really come in to make sure that people have got a clear understanding of their data, what it is and where it is, before they unleash those incredibly powerful technologies.
Yeah, and just picking on kind of some of the points you kind of mentioned about, especially kind of shadow AI, which is, obviously a real challenge. But one of the things we kind of came up, we saw in a report around shadow data that a third of data breaches involved organizations kind of losing data that almost they didn't know they even had. So is that a real challenge for organizations? Just that the starting point is just getting an understanding of what you've got and where it is to start with before, and getting your policies right.
Yeah, I think if you ask any organization, do you know where your data is and do you know what your data is within those multitude of repositories that they've got? Anybody is honestly going to ask that question with a resounding no. Of course they don't. And people need technology to kind of help them deal with that particular scenario. And that's the double-edged sword with AI, because AI is arguably one of the best tools to help you deal with that problem itself as well.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen over recent years, Neil, is a fundamental shift in the way that people are working, right? With the rise of hybrid working, with the rise of cloud computing, organizations are suddenly faced with the fact that their data is anywhere and everywhere. No longer is it in the, say, four walls of a data center as it always used to be. And now it's on endpoints, it's on USB drives, it's up in multiple different cloud repositories that Stuart mentioned there. And the real challenge then is to understand, okay, what do I have? Where is it? But then who's accessing that data and what are they doing with that data? And so, that is a real challenge. Just the volume of data that we're creating every single day leaves this real challenge in terms of how do I understand what's out there and what are people doing with it, right?
Yeah, I wanted to get onto the sheer volume of data is kind of like a bit of a challenge as well. I think that stat was like 90% of data that exists in the world was created in the last 2 years. It's just exponential. It's just terabytes and terabytes every day. How can organizations need to kind of get a grip for a start in terms of the sheer volume of data that they're securing and protecting, but also a lot of that data also won't be important. Some of it will be. So it's understanding all that data. Not everything needs to be secured. I think our kind of default is from it working, in the cybersecurity, everything needs to be secured. But actually, maybe security can it sometimes go too far. Organizations try and almost do too much sometimes as well if they haven't got a handle on what's important. Because we all know not every organization can secure everything, and not everybody. You can't do everything, and that you can't have every single tool. You can't have every single policy. Not everything is achievable. So just prioritization probably should be quite important on that.
Yeah, well, list. I think you're touching upon here a really important part of this data security journey. And even before prioritization, it's the classification of the data, right? Understanding what it is that I have, and then understanding, how important is it? How should I prioritize that data? And this is historically where DLP projects have really struggled to be deployed effectively, because you're relying on your users, you're asking your users to manually classify file types. And of course, in that scenario, they'll either do that effectively, or they'll kind of ignore the prompt that comes up, or they'll give it whatever classification means that they can get on and do their job without the security control getting in their way. And a result of that, I think, is that in DLP projects, they were generally ring-fenced to say, okay, I'm only going to focus on what I consider to be my most critical assets that I can see today. Let me just wrap some policy around that. And frankly, I'm not going to worry about the rest because it's too complex. And that is frequently where DLP projects have stalled or failed or not been effective. But things have changed, right? Now that we are generating so much data, things had to change. But the fundamental thing is artificial intelligence within data security solutions that now enable us to automatically classify this information so that we can now spot, as you're talking about, the redundant, obsolete, or trivial data, the stuff that we don't need to worry about. We can actually classify that as such, so we can kind of park that and say, well, that doesn't present a risk for us. But more importantly, we can spot the critical data across the whole of the environment and say, right, now I can wrap my arms around that. I can classify it effectively and at scale so that beyond that, we can then begin to think about how we do prioritize, how we decide how we want to protect that, and what people can do with that data when they do ultimately gain access to it.
Yeah, and that policy needs to be really important. I mean, we've kind of all seen DLP kind of solutions, even when they've been put in afterwards, have just been defaulted back to monitor mode because they simply can't cope with the number of kind of red flags and alerts and everything. We always talk about alert fatigue, but especially in DLP, it's a real thing. And that's where organizations can lose that balance between security and productivity as well. Because if people can't do their job, that's going to override anything that's kind of kicking off from a security perspective.
Yeah, I mean, security as an enabler for the business is very much the approach that we're taking these days. And to your point around that volume of data, I think it's something like only 20% of data created is original data. So 80% of everything within an environment is duplication or a copy of something that already exists. So to Chris's point around classification, identifying that rot data, that becomes incredibly important, not just from that managing your data perspective, but from the economical impact on a business as well. You're not just putting disks into a storage array in your own environment anymore. You're paying for storage within somebody else's environment. So considerable impact. And then you've got the environmental impact as well that can have when you think of 80% of data right across the globe being created is all duplicate data. And that's, sharing an image file, that's sharing a spreadsheet still, rather than using collaboration tools that, again, all organizations are investing in, but just not using to a fully effective way.
Yeah. So, so where do I suppose if we kind of go back, and where should organisations start on this? Because we see data security, just like a lot of cybersecurity, is taken more seriously in some organisations than other. You see plenty of stats coming up where there was actually one published by a government one by one of the state departments, where the level of board responsibility for cybersecurity had actually gone down in the last 12 months. So they were kind of pushing it downstream to a CIO or a CISO, whatever, and they were not taking that responsibility. So where should organizations start in terms of starting to work on whether it's kind of policy or strategy, because all of that needs to happen before we get to choosing technology and tools and implementation?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is somewhere. Start somewhere, right? And Chris and I were talking earlier today. The reality is, as an individual or an organization, you're never going to have less data than you have today.
Yeah,
that's a fact, right? It's just constantly growing for everybody. So starting somewhere, and we're not precious around where that starting point is. We have a viewpoint, but we've got a number of different steps in terms of how organizations can start to approach how they deal with their overall data security posture, right? So whether that starts with classification, so knowing what their data is, knowing where their data is, or whether it's more important for them to start, protecting their data and putting a block in place, almost irrelevant to the business impact, right? But they just need to do something. Again, they're all options that are available to people. Yeah.
And in terms of the kind of conversations that you've kind of had at a senior level, kind of how is that changing a little bit now? As AI kind of accelerated people's kind of awareness a little bit of needing to do something different. We've seen maybe that they're not taking cybersecurity seriously, but is that going to kind of come back up again because of the fear of AI? And what is driving most positive engagement at senior board level for organizations to change the way that they're approaching cybersecurity and data specifically?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to that, right? I mean, firstly, I completely agree with your point, Stuart. Do something, right? Don't just sit back and kind of hope that everything's going to be okay. I view data security as the very foundation of a strong cybersecurity strategy. You have to understand what it is that you're trying to protect. And when I engage with, senior leaders within business, frequently we'll end up in a conversation around the regulation that may be impacting them, that they have to take extremely seriously, like DORA, for example, or NIS2. These important regulatory bodies are kind of saying that this is not a nice to have. This is a mission critical situation. We have to make sure that you can be compliant. So the first thing is that there's a really strong external driver to say, make sure that you understand the risk that you may be exposed to and that you've got a way to mitigate that risk. Increasingly, organizations have to be aware of the third-party risk they may be open up to from their supply chain. So this is a real tangible challenge that they have to deal with. And then, as you mentioned, AI, I think, again, it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, AI could be an incredible tool to drive productivity within their environments, but it also opens up the risk as well. So they're very concerned about, the demand they may have from within their own organization to say, hey, turn this tool on because it's going to enable me to do my job more effectively. But they also well understand the potential risk that could open them up to. Now, what I see changing is that rather than that then being where the conversation stops because it becomes too hard a problem to solve, because we now include AI within our solutions because that enables our solutions to be more effective in the way that we've discussed, to discover and classify at scale, to prioritize easily. Now they see that AI actually enables them to build this strategy, to execute against this strategy. But really, for me, it all comes back to that need to mitigate risk, to balance the risk that they may be exposed to within their environment. What's the likelihood of that risk materializing, and what's the impact of that risk, So when we talk about data security posture management, for example, the posture management element is effectively risk management, right? Understand what you're exposed to, do something about it. But I see lots of, sometimes conflicting demands driving decisions, within organizations, which, finally, I think we've got a good way to answer that and build a strategy for the future, right? Just find a place to start and we can help you to take the necessary steps.
Yeah, and I think regulation is going to be maybe one of those things that can help trigger some of those changes. I think this year might be a bit of a year of regulation. I think
no doubt
we've seen a lot of organisations in terms of some surveys show that both even in the UK that are responsible for complying with NIS2 that they know about it, but they're definitely not where they need to be. We've got DORA. We're going to have the UK Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. I think that's likely to land this year. We've now been hearing more about it. Is that going to be what? But the danger with regulation is, well, the positive is that it could prompt organizations to kind of do the things that they need to be doing. But is it another side where organizations can kind of sometimes just default back to doing a tick box exercise where we've got this, it's another overhead, let's just do what we need to do to be able to get through it and be compliant. So they're doing what they should be, have to do, rather than what they should be doing from a cybersecurity perspective. It is that balance again.
Yeah, but I think in the past, it might be fair to say that organizations have approached such things as a tick box exercise to say, hey, I've started a program of work and that's enough to satisfy the auditors that, we're trying to do the right thing. Because honestly, the problem was too big and complex to solve. So the best that they could do was maybe start something to protect a small subset of users or a small subset of data. And we're on a path, but frankly, you're still exposed to a ton of risk there. What's changed is technology, right? The solutions are now able to solve that problem in a much more effective way. So you're right. I think this year, I mean, look, DORA, for example, although it was born in 2023, is implemented from January of this year. These are real regulations that are being implemented across the board. But now, we have a suite of solutions that are able to be implemented in a successful way and help organizations to go beyond that tick box and actually move to the point where they can say, okay, I've now got an effective security control in place that gives me great confidence in front of my board that we can report to the regulators and say, yep, don't worry about us. We're safe, we're protected.
Yeah, and you're seeing that as well, that people using that regulation as a confidence point of like, actually, this is a good benchmark for me in terms of being able to do that. And as you say, report back to the board.
Yeah, and I was just going to pick up on the point with Chris, right? I think vendors compounded that problem at that tick box exercise for a number of years. Yeah. So vendors would be shipping, something in their solutions, right, that could tick a box in a certain area of security concern for an organization. Yeah. And the reality is now that organizations look at, okay, we need to be fully compliant. We need to show that we're really doing something proper in this space. They also need to look at the operational cost of doing that in so many different places. And again, that's where the conversations around Forcepoint and what Forcepoint do from a data security platform perspective, really comes into its own, because it's that kind of cradle to grave type approach of being able to cover any of those different areas of data security that someone's looking at in a consistent tool. And that, certainly the conversations we have with customers, that speaks volumes around how they can gain operational efficiency.
Yeah. And is that kind of one of those key areas where AI is going to make the difference from that, that automation element of just stripping a lot of cost? Because one of the things around compliance and regulation often is reporting and it's auditing. It's being able to do what you say you're going to do and then prove you've done what you say to be able to do and then report to say that you've done what you said you were going to do. Is that one of those key elements kind of that AI is going to be able to help in products to be able to streamline regulation compliance to enable teams to be able to concentrate on what they higher value activities?
I think whether that's AI, whether that's just predefined policies within some of these tools as well, the goal of all of those, right, is to streamline, right, to make it more efficient for people. When you talk AI, there's often concerns from people around, well, what's the risk to my job and what I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. When you talk about stripping out those mundane activities, right, the things that people don't enjoy doing, the things, as Chris alluded to, a classification where people aren't necessarily very good at doing those things. Yep. And again, interpreting data in large volumes can be one of those things as well. If you can introduce AI to cover those use cases, I think that's a bit of a no-brainer, right, from an organization's perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And you look at the capability of the tools now when it comes to reporting, you can do forensic analysis of what's happened, with data lineage, for example. You can see exactly back in time what's happened with, in a particular incident. You're able to report in much greater, more granular detail than you've ever been able to do. So, not just AI, right? It comes down to the policies that you're wrapping around and placing over your data, but your ability now to be able to produce meaningful reports more effectively, that is undoubtedly an advantage for any security operations team out there, to give them the ability, again, to produce these reports, to do that analysis, to report back to the powers that be, shall we say, that, we understand what's happening in our environment, why it happened, we understood who accessed this information. And for us, that extends beyond just reporting on it into what we call risk adaptive protection. Yeah. So we actually want to get ahead of the ball, not just be behind it and report on what's happened, but we want to get ahead of that and think about what might happen. Yeah. So now we're able to look at any particular scenario, any user in a given environment and understand, what good looks like. What does this user do on a normal day-to-day basis within their role? What data are they accessing? What are they doing with that information? That's normal. We're happy. for this to continue. But therefore, we're also able to spot when something deviates from that norm, if you will. When somebody becomes more risky, we can spot what's happening within that environment and apply a score. And ultimately, if necessary, we can take it all the way to the point where we're going to block risky behavior because we've seen something fundamentally different happening, such as, exfiltration of data on a different channel, printing something out, taking screenshots, whatever it may be. So yes, we're able to report on what's happened, but we can also get ahead of that and report on, okay, this is what we think is likely to happen in this situation. You might want to have a look at that and think about, how you respond to that particular situation.
And that was the point around, security being a business enabler now and not just a blocker.
Yeah.
So, the default doesn't have to be block day one, right? The default can be to allow access to data so that people can more freely do their jobs. And as they exhibit risky behaviors, as Chris suggests, that's when you can start ratcheting things down and make the security tool work for you in your own particular environment.
Yeah. And what I love about this is that, the tool, the security control now becomes very effective, but it's not invasive. It's not stopping people getting their jobs done. And I think as humans, if there's a security control in place that consistently stops you being productive because a pop-up's coming up all of the time, or, you're naturally going to find a way around that security control, and you're going to justify that action to your boss by saying, hey, I needed to get my job done, so I turned off that control, or I kind of ignored that, or I classified that document differently because I had to get my job done. I'm not worried about the risk I'm exposing the company to there. I just need to get my job done. So when security gets in the way, then people will naturally try and find a way around it. But with these more modern cybersecurity tools, the way that we're able to implement them, so we're observing what's happening, but we're still able to take action and spot where the problems are occurring, we're not impacting people's productivity. In fact, we're enabling people's productivity in a much more effective way because we're giving access to the latest tools, to the latest AI, whatever it may be, but we're securing, we're making sure that nothing unintentional is going to happen in the background.
I think like a really good example around that. So I was talking to customers this morning and they're kind of saying, well, how much do you know about us and what we do? And they're, slight tangent from data security, but their instant response is, well, I know you because you blocked me from accessing a certain website. And actually to flip that conversation on its head and say, well, at the 999 other times you access something on the web that's permitted and coming through, right? Or you're sending an email and that's getting through because we've scanned that to make sure the content is allowed to leave your organization. That's also us, right? We're enabling you for that other 99.99% of the time. But the one memory you have is just on that one time, right, that put a bit of a block in place for you.
Yeah, but that's a classic example, right? A great use case that we're helping to protect organizations against is that classic insider threat, right? And the thing that always springs to mind when you say insider threat, at least for me anyway, is like somebody doing something on purpose, maliciously to steal some data. But frequently, an insider threat could be a very innocent act by a user that unintentionally exposes the organization to risk, right?
Yeah, clicking on a link, giving over credentials, that that data exfiltration comes from that, but it's somebody doing something accidentally, but it is inside. And everything that we talk about around, the kind of data and users are at the core, as you mentioned, of cybersecurity, because data is the holy grail. That's what, in terms of the vast majority of cyber attacks, that, there's a monetary outcome that they want, and that monetary outcome invariably is around data in terms of either holding it to ransom or exfiltration and then doing something else with it. And we all know the stats around 90%, 88%, whatever it happens to be, of data breaches involving humans. It is always around the user. So any data security policy has to have that kind of interaction with the user at their core, because that's what companies are built of, and it's the data that they're engaging with that are what we're trying to ultimately protect most of all out of everything in terms of the priorities on that cybersecurity strategy.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Neil. And, we have seen a significant rise in ransomware attacks, so in that scenario, you're quite right. They're holding you to ransom. They're trying to get some monetary gain from this situation. So we've undoubtedly seen a rise in ransomware attacks recently. But, cyber threats are not limited to that, of course. They may be after your intellectual property. They may be after, causing some kind of disruption for critical national infrastructure. There's lots of other different types of threat which might not be monetary related, but more around how do we gain. It's all about how do we drive an outcome for the criminal, of course, But this is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, from a cyber crime perspective. And it's something that we're constantly fighting against. And much as AI is good for us as we're protecting against this, it's also good for them, right? Because it's helping them to drive more innovative ways to think about gaining access to organizations. It kind of it's on both sides of the fence, that we're trying to defend against these ever more advanced threats.
It's an absolute arms race to be able to use it most effectively.
Yeah, but I think that's what I love about this industry, Neil, right? It's always this game of a little bit like a game of cat and mouse, right? And it's ever changing, ever evolving, and it's a very interesting place to be for that reason.
Yeah, and I think that the talking about kind of how it can be that productivity enabler as well is obviously, we all know that kind of COVID changed everything in terms of the dynamic, working from home, changing the edge of the network. The edge of the network is, your kid's iPad that because your corporate laptop has, I don't know, kind of decided to reboot blue screen or just run out of battery. So you grab another iPad because you want to check your work email, and now you could be absolutely anywhere on any device accessing company data. If we can get these data security tools working as effectively as possible, that means organizations can just fundamentally change how their users are working in the most productive way possible.
Yeah, and I think what you're touching on there, Neil, is we're not just talking about securing data. What you're describing there is the need for context, right?
Yeah.
To understand the situation. We don't just want to automatically block if somebody's accessing data from a coffee shop.
Yep.
Because actually they may be doing it in the right way, in a secure way, accessing non-essential data, non-prioritized data. So, I'm okay with that use case, with that scenario, right? So the context to the situation is absolutely vital to enable productivity. If we just go around blocking everything because it's being accessed on a personal device from a certain location, your traveling executives are going to get pretty frustrated pretty quickly, right? So if we understand the context, who's accessing, how are they accessing, what's the device that they're coming in from, what are they doing with the data when they've got their hands on it, all of that context together could build a risk score that I mentioned earlier and say, you know what? I'm okay with that. Actually, that's not risky. That person's allowed to be doing that. So let's continue and let them get their job done. And conversely, of course, if you see something happening that doesn't meet that requirement for the risk score being as low as possible, then we can take action, right? And we could notify, we could block, whatever it is that's appropriate, right? But it's the context to the situation, I think, that's vital.
It's kind of taking that zero trust approach to data, right? And starting with do they even need to access that data, right? Is that a fundamental part of their job where they should have access to that data?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that frequently, and again, this is the risk with implementing AI within an organization as a productivity tool. If you don't have your data, well understood, you can find that people have access to far more data than they should. It's over provisioned, in other words, and you could find people with access to, the HR records or the financial records, and then they inadvertently put that into the large language model, and once it's out there, right, you're never getting it back, right? It becomes something that people can search on, and worst case scenario, if you're deploying Copilot within your environment, maybe you've got to tear that down and start again, right? Because information's leaked into it that you just can't get back out of the model, right? So there's implications to not getting that right from the start.
Yeah, and is there a bigger cultural impact within organisations that we're necessarily kind of aware of? I think kind of that move from working from home and using BYOD and all of these things. Employees kind of did that, and some of them did it better than others. And some, when we're talking to our partners about when you talk to your customers, I always like to ask the question: how many of them have changed? Well, first of all, do they do cybersecurity training, not just awareness training where you get told off for clicking on a phishing email, but do they do training effectively? But have they changed their training since COVID, since they let everybody work from home? The number is typically on average less than 50%, which is a little bit worrying. But I think employees did kind of seize that opportunity of I can work more flexibly, I can work more productively, because they kind of owned that change, if you like, and they could feel the benefit from it. When we as a security industry all talk about kind of zero trust, and actually this is what we want to get to. We want to kind of default block, we're going to let you only do what you should be doing. But are we kind of underestimating the impact? No, because previously you could just VPN and I'm on my corporate device and now I can access everything as if I'm in a network. Now I might not need to do it, and it might not be a problem if I can't do it, but it is a change. And we always have to take employees and we have to take everybody with us. Do we sometimes underestimate the difficulty, the changes that are going to impact on employees about moving to a zero trust model because of the importance of taking us with it? But that will be a big change for how a lot of employees work.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an educational thing,
Yeah.
right? So 100% it's a change, but the educational part is, well, just because you could do something, right? You don't need to do that for your job.
Yeah.
So therefore, why would you need to do that going forwards as well? So yeah, I think culturally it is. And I think the longer that people have been working in that fashion, right, the more reliant they become on it and just that ability to do whatever they want. Obviously, the pandemic just drove overnight adoption of certain practices, probably with less security and less control than people would have liked to have had in place. But it's got to be a bit of a natural progression, like backwards, to start locking things down and securing them more, but not disrupting people from doing their job. And I think that's the key, crucial difference. Right, you're not talking about just switching everything off. You're talking about enabling them to do the things that they need to for their job, right? Not to be disruptive to getting their job done.
It's one of those things. If security can be seamless, where if they're doing what they should be doing and they don't notice any change, that's the silver bullet, isn't it? Because then it's not viewed as being a blocker.
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
right.
being a problem.
It cannot be that blocker, because we're living in this hybrid world now, highly mobile world. If I just look at what I've done today, I've been on my phone as I'm walking down the train platform. I'm on the train, I get online using my corporate laptop, and then, I walk here and back onto the phone, and all the time I'm running my European business from all these different devices, and I have to trust that security, and I know that security is in place. If security was getting in the way of me doing my job at that point, well, there'd be some pretty robust feedback going back into my organization saying, hey, you're slowing me down here. I'm moving at pace all of the time, approving quotations or reviewing certain situations, communicating on Teams, whatever it may be. But we're all operating in that way. So, we have to be able to do that. But we also must make sure that, cyber training is in place, make sure that people are healthily paranoid about the risks that may be presented to them, such as not clicking on the links, as you've mentioned, and making sure that we have some basic level of cybersecurity awareness within organizations. We can't put everything back onto the user and say, hey, security depends upon you doing the right thing. But equally, we can take steps to make sure that people are more aware of the risks that could materialize, that do materialize in this world around us, right?
Yeah, I'm just most impressed you managed to get online on the train.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got coverage, I think that's a win to start with. So I suppose, it is enabling employees to be able to own it, isn't it?
Yeah.
As well, to be able to have that kind of not having the responsibility of you can't click on a link, otherwise you could, endanger the entire company.
Yeah.
But if they have that responsibility in a positive way, then that's you are taking them on that journey. Therefore,
absolutely, it's all part of the puzzle, right? I mean, there's always the chance that they will click on the link. Okay, so what?
Yep.
What are we going to do then, and how do we still secure ourselves? But if we could stop them clicking in the first place, so much the better, right? And coming back to the point that, okay, clicking on a link or accessing a file, okay, why are they doing that? Let's try and understand the context of what's happened there, so we take appropriate action and make sure that we're kind of either allowing that action or we're kind of taking steps to stop it.
Yeah.